Imagine that you are a detective and you have been assigned an investigation of special importance. This case is not about financial fraud or the disappearance of a person or a conspiracy against the state. It concerns a question on which not only the course of human history depends, but also your future after death. That question is, did Jesus of Nazareth rise on the third day after his execution? You may be an atheist, agnostic, Muslim, Jew, or Christian. It doesn't matter. In the face of the facts, each of us has an obligation to be honest. Either this is the greatest fraud or it is the greatest miracle in history. There is no middle ground. The writer and scholar C.S. Lewis once said, "Christianity, if it is false, is utterly irrelevant. But if it is true, it matters infinitely. The only thing it cannot be is merely moderately important." That is why you are now holding a dossier in your hands. Case number 33, A.D., Crucifixion, the empty tomb, mass testimony, the lightning-fast growth of a new movement, and tens of millions of lives turned upside down. You ready? Then let's open a case. Fact number 1, Jesus really did die. Many modern skeptics, especially among Muslims, hypothesize that perhaps Jesus did not die on the cross. Perhaps he was rescued, or perhaps he lost consciousness and woke up in the coolness of the tomb. But is this the case? The historical reliability of Jesus' death on the cross is one of the most confirmed events of antiquity. Even atheists recognize this fact as historical. 1.1 Historical confirmation of Christ's death outside of the Bible. Many people think that everything we know about Jesus comes from the Bible. It doesn't. His death is mentioned in pagan and Jewish sources. Tacitus, Roman historian, circa 116 AD. Christ, from whose name Christians derive, was executed under Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. Annales 15.44. Josephus Flavius, a first-century Jewish historian, writes of Jesus' execution under Pilate. Lucian of Samosata, a second-century satirist, mocks Christians who worship the crucified sage. The Talmud, a Jewish source, says that Jesus was hanged on the eve of Passover, the traditional designation of execution. This is an admission of hostile sources. They do not seek to confirm the Christian faith, but unwittingly testify Jesus was executed. 1.2 The Roman practice of crucifixion, torture leading to death. Crucifixion was not just an execution, but a technology of slow murder. The person died from suffocation, blood loss, shock, pain, dehydration, sometimes within a few days. What happened to Jesus? He was scourged before crucifixion. Scourges with bone and metal tips tore the skin and muscles, exposing the bones. Then crucifixion, nails driven into his wrists and feet. Hanging on the cross made breathing difficult. To breathe, the crucified had to lift himself up on the nails. Finally, the thrust of the spear. A Roman soldier pierces Jesus' side, and immediately blood and water flowed out. John 19:34. Medical analysis, Dr. William Edwards, Journal of the American Medical Association, 1986, indicates that this is a separate flow of blood and pleural fluid, a sign of death. Jesus died under the supervision of Roman soldiers, professionals in execution. Pilate ascertains that he is dead before allowing his body to be removed. Mark 15:44-45. No one, neither friends nor enemies, doubted his death. 1.3 The myth of not dead but awake. a theory that contradicts common sense. The fainting theory does not stand up to criticism. A man scarred beyond repair who spent more than 36 hours without water or medical attention would not have been able to get out of a tomb with a huge stone, sealed and guarded, on his own. He would not have elicited enthusiasm from the disciples, but rather pity. "Oh, poor Jesus, let's help him." Not, "He has conquered death. He is Lord." Summary: Jesus of Nazareth died on the cross. This is a recognized medical, historical, and logically proven fact. The investigation is ongoing. Part 2. The empty tomb, evidence that cannot be ignored. If Jesus was not resurrected, then where is his body? Why has no one produced it? Why was the tomb empty despite a carefully organized burial? Why did even Christ's enemies have to concoct explanations to support the very fact that there was no body? These questions don't disappear. They become the beginning of the second key piece of evidence. The tomb of Jesus was empty. 2.1 A surprising beginning. The witnesses are women. All four Gospels state with remarkable unity. The first news of the empty tomb came from women. It was they who came early in the morning to the burial place to finish the funeral rites and found the stone rolled away and the body gone. Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb early while it was still dark and sees the stone rolled away from the tomb. John 20 verse 1. To the modern reader, this may seem like an ordinary description. But in a first-century context, such a detail is almost scandalous. Women in Jewish society were not considered reliable witnesses. Their testimony was not accepted in court, and men who drafted official documents did not refer to women's accounts if it could be avoided. So the obvious question is, why didn't the evangelists invite the story, replace the women with men? If they were making up the story, it would be much more convenient to say that Peter or John were the first. But they don't, because they tell it the way it really was. And it is this inconvenient truth that is the most powerful circumstantial evidence for the authenticity of the event described. 2.2. The tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a known place, not anonymous. The second important detail: Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the Sanhedrin. This means that the place of burial was specific and known. People were free to come and see if the body was there. If Jesus' body was still in the tomb, the early preaching of the resurrection could have been instantly exposed. It is important to note, according to Jewish tradition, the bodies of criminals were not usually buried with respect. In the case of Jesus, however, an exception occurred. Joseph, despite his high position in the council, dared to publicly ask Pilate for Jesus' body, wrapped a clean shroud around it, and placed it in a new tomb carved in the rock. Matthew 27:57-60. This meant that the tomb was in a good, easily accessible location near Golgotha, making it available for inspection the very next day. If the disciples a few weeks or months after Jesus' death began to say that he had risen, but the tomb still contained a body, they would have been immediately pointed to it. Christianity would not have survived a week, but the tomb was empty. The Jewish and Roman authorities could not produce the body because there was no body. 2.2. The tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a known place, not anonymous. The second important detail: Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the Sanhedrin. This means that the place of burial was specific and known. People were free to come and see if the body was there. If Jesus' body was still in the tomb, the early preaching of the resurrection could have been instantly exposed. It is important to note, according to Jewish tradition, the bodies of criminals were not usually buried with respect. In the case of Jesus, however, an exception occurred. Joseph, despite his high position in the council, dared to publicly ask Pilate for Jesus' body, wrapped a clean shroud around it, and placed it in a new tomb carved in the rock. Matthew 27:57-60. This meant that the tomb was in a good, easily accessible location near Golgotha, making it available for inspection the very next day. If the disciples a few weeks or months after Jesus' death began to say that he had risen, but the tomb still contained a body, they would have been immediately pointed to it. Christianity would not have survived a week, but the tomb was empty. The Jewish and Roman authorities could not produce the body because there was no body. The answer offered by the chief priests themselves sounded strange. They bribed the guards to say that the disciples stole the body while they were sleeping. Matthew 28:12-13. But if the soldiers were asleep, how could they know who stole the body? And if asleep, why did every last one of them? This alone makes the official version internally inconsistent and unreliable. Besides, a Roman soldier who fell asleep on duty would normally expect to be executed. But in this case, it did not happen. Why? Probably because the authorities themselves were at a loss. They knew the body had disappeared, but they didn't know how. The only thing they could do was to control the story, even if it was illogical. 2.4. Why couldn't the disciples have stolen the body? Some skeptics offer the old theory. They say the disciples stole the body. But consider, the disciples were terrified and scattered. On the night of the arrest, they scattered. Peter denied it. No one was prepared for the daring operation of breaking into the tomb. They feared for their lives. If they were caught trying to steal the body, they'd face the death penalty. No motive. If the disciples knew that Jesus had not risen, why would they risk their lives, torture, death, for a lie? Subsequently, all the disciples suffered for their faith in the resurrection, and none denied it. Who would die for what they knew was a lie? The very fact that the preaching of the resurrection began in Jerusalem, the same city where Jesus was crucified and buried, just 7 weeks after the events, speaks volumes. Had the body still been in the tomb, the crowd would have dispersed immediately. But instead, thousands believed despite the danger. Why? Because the tomb was empty. Because people could go and check it out for themselves. Because something happened, something that changed everything. The empty tomb is not a myth, but a fact that needs an explanation. The empty tomb is an undeniable historical reality, recognized by both proponents and critics of Christianity. Fact number 3. Encounters with the Risen One. Witnesses too numerous to ignore. If an empty tomb is evidence, the appearances of the Risen One are witnesses too numerous to ignore. We are not dealing with 1 or 2 mystical encounters, but with a series of verifiable, described independent events in which the risen Jesus appears to different people at different times under different circumstances. One of the most important texts that records the sequence of Sunday appearances is 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. This is not a late insertion, but the earliest Christian creed known to us, appearing at most 3 to 5 years after the resurrection. And that he rose again on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, of whom most are still alive. Then he appeared to James, also to all the apostles, and after all, appeared also to me. Let's take a close look at to whom and how Jesus appeared after the resurrection. To Mary Magdalene, in the garden at the tomb. To women, when returning from the tomb. To Peter, separately in a special personal communion. To the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, evening conversation, accompanied by the explanation of the scriptures and the breaking of bread. To the 10 disciples in the evening of the same day, Thomas and the other apostles 8 days later, the 7 disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, morning, fishing, and lunch on the shore. More than 500 brothers at one time, mentioned by Paul as available living witnesses. To James, the brother of Jesus, who did not believe in him before the resurrection. To the apostles on the mountain in Galilee, at the ascension on the Mount of Olives. To Paul, much later in an unusual revelation. These meetings took place at different times of the day, morning, afternoon, evening, in different places, in the garden, in houses, on the road, by the sea, on the mountain, in different moods, in fear, in doubt, in joy, indoors and outdoors, among food, conversation, walks. These are not a series of deceptive visions. They are comprehensive, varied events recorded by several people at once. Fact number 3, the radical transformation of the disciples, from fear to boldness. One of the most striking proofs of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the remarkable, dramatic, and inexplicable transformation of his disciples. People who had been hiding from fear suddenly become fearless witnesses. Those who had just fled the scene of the crucifixion now come out into the public square to openly proclaim, "He lives." What has happened to these people? What could have changed them so profoundly and forever? If we read the Gospels carefully, we see, at the moment of Jesus' arrest, all the disciples fled. Matthew 26:56. One young man, probably Mark, was in such a hurry to escape that he threw off his clothes and ran naked. Mark 14:51-52. Peter, the boldest of them all, denies Jesus 3 times. Luke 22:54-62. The others disappear from the horizon. After the crucifixion, the disciples are in a state of shock, fear, and despair. They shut themselves in the house, fearing that someone will come for them. John 20:19. 2 go to Emmaus, disappointed, saying, "But we had hoped that he was the one who should deliver Israel." Luke 24:21. This is a portrait of psychologically broken people who have experienced tragedy, loss, and the collapse of all hope. They have no faith, no plan, no courage, only emptiness. Only a few weeks pass, and the same men become the leaders of a powerful new movement preaching Christ in Jerusalem. Peter, who had recently denied Jesus to a servant girl, now rebukes the chief priests, declaring, "You crucified him, but God raised him up." On the day of Pentecost, Peter preaches before thousands of people. More than 3,000 believe. The apostles testify openly in the temple despite threats and arrests, Acts 2-5. When first questioned, they say, "We ought to obey God rather than men." The apostles rejoice that they have been honored to suffer for the name of Jesus, Acts 5. Peter and John become pillars of the church, risking everything to evangelize. Thomas, called an unbeliever, goes as far as India, where he dies a martyr. Matthew goes to Ethiopia. Andrew goes to the Balkans. Bartholomew goes to Armenia. Paul, a former persecutor, becomes a most tireless missionary. These men are not just changed, they are completely reincarnated. And the reason for this is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The disciples act like real witnesses to something amazing. Their reactions are not theatrical, but real. They are shocked. They don't immediately believe. They doubt. They test. They touch. This is not mass hysteria, not fanaticism. It is a sober, agonizing faith, born through struggle, doubt, personal experience. Thomas's example is particularly powerful. He refuses to believe without physical evidence. And then, when he sees Jesus, he falls down and says, "My Lord and my God." John 20:28. Thus is born not deception, but truth. Fact number 5, conversion of enemies. Witnesses against themselves. History knows many cases of a leader's supporters continuing his cause after his death. But one of the most unexpected and hard-to-explain phenomena of early Christianity is the conversion of two of Jesus' most vocal opponents into ardent followers. Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul, and James, Jesus' brother. These two men are not just skeptics. They are in their own way hostile to Jesus. One is a fierce persecutor. The other is a brother who did not believe in him in his lifetime. But both become pillars of the church, preaching the resurrection as a historical reality. Their stories are an explosive argument in favor of the resurrection. Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor who became an apostle. Who was Saul? The Saul we know as the Apostle Paul was, a Pharisee of the Pharisees, a zealot and expert in the law, a disciple of the famous Gamaliel, a staunch opponent of the Jesus movement. He did not simply disbelieve in Jesus. He persecuted Christians, approved the murder of Stephen, dragged men and women to dungeons, breathing threats and murder. Acts 9:1-2. This was a religious fanatic, absolutely convinced he were doing God's work. What happened to him? On the road to Damascus, Saul experiences something radical. He sees a blinding light and hears a voice say, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to go against the horn." And he asks, "Who are you, Lord?" The answer is, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Acts 9:5. This event turns his whole life upside down. Saul loses his sight, fasts for 3 days, and then receives healing from Ananias. From that moment, he becomes a Christian and not just a believer, one of the greatest apostles. He writes a significant portion of the New Testament, suffers, wanders, endures beatings, stoning, imprisonment. He dies a martyr's death for Christ. Why is his story so important? Most importantly, he claims to have seen the risen Jesus. Not an image, not an idea, not a feeling, but an actual personal risen Christ who spoke to him. He writes, "But after all appeared to me, as to a certain outcast. I labored more than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God." 1 Corinthians 15:8-10. James is a brother who did not believe during Jesus' lifetime. What do we know about James? James is the son of Mary and Joseph, the half-brother of Jesus. In the Gospels, he and the other brothers did not believe in him. Moreover, one day they come to take him by force, thinking he has gone out of himself. Mark 3:21. From a human perspective, this is familial rejection. James, who grew up with Jesus, did not think of him as the Messiah. What happened after the resurrection? The Apostle Paul writes, "Then he appeared to James." After this encounter, James becomes head of the Jerusalem church, leader among the apostles, author of the Epistle of James, spiritual counselor of the early Christians. The Jewish historian Josephus Flavius and the writer Eusebius report that James died a martyr's death by being thrown from the roof of the temple and stoned, for believing in Jesus as the Messiah. Why does this matter? James's conversion is one of the most powerful proofs of the resurrection. This man lived with Jesus, didn't believe in him, but after a single encounter with the risen one, he becomes one of the key pillars of early Christianity. What could have changed his mind? Only an unplanned, real encounter with the risen brother he knew best. What do Paul and James have in common? Both were not followers of Jesus in his lifetime. Neither expected his resurrection. Both claimed to have personally seen the risen one. Both became leaders of the church. Both died martyrs for their faith. This cannot be fabricated. This is the conversion of real, sane, stubborn people who did not seek the faith but were seized by it. The testimonies of Paul and James are evidence to the contrary. They did not want to believe. They were not subject to the emotions of the apostles, but they are the ones who become the key witnesses because they saw something immutable. If even those who oppose Jesus become his followers, it means that they did meet the living Christ. And that encounter changed everything. Fact number 6, the beginning of the church and its lightning fast growth. One of the key evidences confirming the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the abrupt and impressive start of the Christian church, a community based on the preaching of the risen Savior, and its rapid growth in the face of a hostile world. Analyzing this phenomenon allows us to assess the reality of the resurrection, not only from a historical, but also from sociological and psychological perspectives. First, the birth of the church at Pentecost. The event described in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, represents a key moment. On the day of Pentecost, the feast of the giving of the Holy Spirit, the apostles and disciples of Jesus received a powerful spiritual inspiration and boldness. More than 3,000 people were baptized and joined the Christian community on this very day. This massive change shows that the preaching of the risen Christ was not empty rhetoric, but had a real spiritual and emotional foundation. Second, the uniqueness of lightning-fast growth. The attention of historians has been drawn to the unusual speed of growth of the new religious community. In the first decades after the resurrection, Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, from Jerusalem to Rome and beyond. There was no strong political support or material incentives, only the power of testimony and the conviction of a real resurrection. Such rapid growth is phenomenally rare for a religious movement of that time. Third, social and cultural conditions. This explosive growth took place in the face of stiff opposition from Jewish religious authorities, active persecution by the Roman administration, lack of modern means of communication. Despite these obstacles, Christianity grew and strengthened, indicating the powerful inner strength and truthfulness of its foundation. Fourth, changes in the behavior and outlook of the followers. The new followers of Christianity were radically changing their habits and values, a rejection of idolatry, increased social justice and mutual aid, a rejection of violence and persecution. Such a radical shift was impossible without the deep inner conviction associated with a personal encounter with the risen Christ. Fifth, the impact of the resurrection on the organization and leadership of the church. The apostles and early leaders of the church preached a sermon inextricably linked to the resurrection. Peter, John, and Paul all emphasized that their mission was based on the risen Christ. Leadership was not formal, but based on deep faith and personal experience of encounter with Christ. Sixth, failure to explain the growth of the church without the resurrection Historians and sociologists agree that it is extremely difficult to explain the emergence and success of Christianity without the resurrection event. Competing religions and sects have not achieved similar successes without a similar historical foundation. The resurrection is a powerful catalyst that changed the course of history. 7. Impact on societal and moral norms. The growth of the church influenced a change in society. Christianity preached the equality of all people before God, supported the defense of the weak, the poor, and the oppressed. It placed moral and spiritual values above material values. This transformation was made possible by the power of the resurrection to inspire hope and confidence. The dramatic and sustained growth of the Christian church in the face of resistance and persecution is a powerful testimony that its foundation, the risen Jesus, was alive and active among the people. Without the resurrection, the enthusiasm, courage, and influence of this movement cannot be explained. Alternative theories of the resurrection and their untenability. The question of the resurrection of Jesus Christ arouses lively interest and controversy not only among believers, but also among skeptics, historians, and philosophers. Over the past 2 millennia, many alternative hypotheses have emerged that attempt to explain the emptiness of the tomb and the appearances of the resurrected one without actually returning to life. This part is devoted to a critical analysis of these theories in order to show their weaknesses and their inability to explain all the historical facts. First, the stolen body theory. One of the most common hypotheses is that the disciples or others allegedly stole Jesus' body from the tomb and passed it off as a resurrection. Proponents' arguments: the body disappeared, so someone took it. Analysis: Roman guards carefully guarded the tomb. The risk of being caught was enormous. The disciples were frightened and scattered after Jesus' arrest. They would not have shown the courage for such a daring theft. If the body had been stolen, why preach martyrdom when you could simply say, "He was not resurrected"? The religious authorities, too, could easily disprove the resurrection by presenting the body. Conclusion: the stolen body theory does not explain the courage of the apostles and the extent of faith in the resurrection. Second, the theory of visions and hallucinations. According to this hypothesis, the apostles and disciples experienced collective or individual visions of the resurrected one caused by grief and psychological stress. Arguments: the experience of intense grief could have led to illusory visions. Analysis: hallucinations are individualized and rarely coincide in time and space in different people. Different groups of people on different days and circumstances saw the resurrected man. These phenomena occurred over a period of weeks rather than on a single occasion. Hallucinations do not explain the appearance of real physical evidence, the empty tomb, the change in behavior of the apostles. Conclusion: the theory of visions is incapable of explaining multiple and consistent testimonies. Third, the symbolic resurrection theory. This view argues that the resurrection is a metaphor, a symbol of spiritual rebirth, rather than a historical fact. Arguments: many religious teachings use symbols to convey truth. Analysis: the Gospels and Apostles describe the resurrection as a physical event. Paul emphasizes the resurrection of the body, not just a spiritual state. The symbolic interpretation does not explain why the early Christians claimed encounters with a living person who ate, spoke, and touched them. Conclusion: the symbolic theory contradicts the direct evidence of the New Testament. Fourth, the sleeper or coma theory. Some have suggested that Jesus did not die on the cross, but only fell into unconsciousness from which he later awoke. Arguments. It is possible that Jesus regained consciousness after being taken down from the cross. Analysis. Roman soldiers trained in execution confirm Jesus' death. The spear piercing and blood and water indicate a true death. After such prolonged suffering and severe wounds, revival to life would have been physiologically impossible. The disciples could not have accepted the message of resurrection if he had simply woken up. It would not have had the same power and significance. Conclusion: the sleeper theory does not stand up to medical and historical scrutiny. Fifth, the theory of myth and legend. Skeptics argue that the resurrection stories are a late myth created to magnify Jesus. Arguments: myths are often created to support religious ideologies. Analysis: the Gospels were written close to the events, within 30 to 60 years after the resurrection. Many witnesses were alive and could refute the lies. The apostles and early Christians did not pursue fame or money, but instead endured persecution and death. Myths rarely create such detailed and emotionally charged stories backed by real facts. Conclusion: myth theory does not explain the historical accuracy and personal testimony of the apostles. Sixth, the complexity of historical facts and the impossibility of explaining them without the resurrection. Cumulatively, the empty tomb. The multitude of witnesses to the resurrected one's appearances. Radical changes in the lives of the disciples. Rapid growth and spread of Christianity. The absence of a body to refute. The apostles' willingness to be martyred. All of which creates an impenetrable wall for alternative hypotheses. Bottom line: alternative explanations don't hold up to scrutiny. None of the alternative theories can comprehensively and logically explain all of the historical data surrounding Jesus' resurrection. Their failure only lends credence to the traditional understanding that Jesus did rise from the dead. Conclusion: personal choice before the facts. Final analysis: what the totality of the facts say. We have conducted a comprehensive study. We have considered the death of Jesus Christ as a reliable historical fact, the empty tomb, and the impossibility of explaining it by conventional means. The numerous accounts of the appearances of the risen Jesus, the transformation of the disciples and their willingness to die for their faith, the explosive growth of the church amidst persecution and despair, the conversion of opponents of Christ, the collapse of all alternative theories before the force of facts. Each of these arguments, taken separately, is already a matter for serious reflection, but taken together, they form a tightrope that is not easily broken. This is not mere religious dogma. It is not the fruit of faith in faith. It is a statement backed by history, logic, evidence, and millions of human destinies forever changed by this truth. Why this question matters to you personally. We are not dealing with a distant and abstract philosophical question. We are talking about a person who has declared that she is the Son of God, that she died for you and rose again for you. We are standing before a person who has left a mark not only on history, but on billions of hearts. If Christ is really risen, then everything he said about himself is true. If Christ is not risen, then all Christianity is a deception and none of its commandments are valid. The Apostle Paul is not afraid to admit this. If Christ is not risen, our preaching is vain, and your faith is also vain. But he immediately declares, "But Christ is risen from the dead, the firstborn of the dead." The question is, will you accept it? Christ knocks. But you decide Christ does not force. He doesn't demand worship by force. He invites it. He is the risen, living one who has conquered death and hell. He offers you not religion, but forgiveness, reconciliation, meaning, and new life. But the decision is yours. You may say, it's too unbelievable. But look again at the facts. You may say, I'm not ready yet. But no one knows how much time he has. You can say, it's too good to be true. But the resurrection is the gospel. Too good for us to make up on our own. Make a decision. You stand at a crossroads. You know enough to reject or accept. Rejection is also a choice. Accept his resurrection, and with it his life, his love, his kingdom. Let this day be the beginning of a new story for you. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will come to life.